Hey, hello, my faithful followers. Today I'm going to talk about some crochet basics. Um, Not necessarily crochet stitches, but things that might make crochet a little easier for you, or be a little more helpful. Things that are not just, once you know your basic stitches, just little tips and tricks that might make things a little bit easier. I know Donna and she's working on a crochet top, and one of the things that I wasn't going to include, but I decided to include was foundation stitches. And we had talked about, she's got a pattern that has you do a foundation single crochet, which can be a little fussy. It's almost like a little new technique to learn, but I'm going to show you how to do it today because there are reasons why you might want to use it. And I've actually found a really good tutorial that I can share with you also. So beyond what I show you here today. So here's what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to talk about how to recognize your stitches, which is, I think, one of the biggest downfalls for people, particularly if they are already knitters. Crochet stitches look different enough that it's harder to recognize them and what kind of stitch it is and how many you have. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about foundation stitches. I'm going to show you how to do a magic ring. I'm going to show you how to do an invisible join. So when you are finishing in particular a project in the round, how to finish it so that you don't have like a little gappy or loose area. I'm going to show you how to weave in and secure ends in crochet. It's a little bit different than knitting. And then lastly, I'm going to show you how to join yarn, either if you're joining the same color to each other, or if you are starting a new row with a new color, the best way to switch colors and to join new yarn. So that's what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to share my screen a lot here, so I'm going to go ahead and switch over to that. And I'll put this up on the website as usual, and also the site that I really like that I think is very helpful. And a lot of my material came today from a website called crystalsandcrochet.com. She also has a Facebook group that people answer questions and do things on, but she's got great picture tutorials and video tutorials, because sometimes you just want to like do a quick look and see. And then she's also got the video to take you through the whole thing. And I think she does a really, really nice job. This is one of the best pictures I've seen for the progression of stitches. And how to recognize stitches. So this has some stitches you may never have done before. We've got single crochet. She's got 2 single crochet stitches here. We have half double crochet, double crochet, triple crochet, double triple crochet, and triple crochet. So the thing that you probably already know about crochet stitches is that they vary in height. The different stitches can vary. They're always going to be, unless you're combining stitches, they're always going to be the same width, but the height of the stitch changes. And you do that by the number of yarn overs you do either before you enter the stitch or during the stitch. So I just want to point out here, if you were looking from the side, you had a piece of crochet and you weren't sure what, you've lost your place in your pattern, which is typically where I having to go back and figure out what my stitches were. I could look to see what stitches I had already done. So these first 2 stitches are single crochet. They are the shortest. The only thing shorter is a slip stitch, which wouldn't show up from the side. It would just show up from the top. But a single crochet is just looks like a V. There is no diagonal crossing the stitch. So I know those are single crochets. When you get into a half double crochet, which starts with a yarn over before you do the stitch, that yarn over creates this little diagonal that crosses the stitch. You can see it here and here, and it is absent on the single crochet. It is also here on the double crochet. You've got your diagonal here. And that shows you that you've done one yarn over. And since it's got the loop of it, I know this was a double crochet. For a triple crochet, you've got you wrap the yarn twice before you go into the stitch. And you've got 2 diagonals crossing. And 2 diagonals crossing here. Okay. For a double triple crochet, wow. You wrap the yarn 3 times and you get 1, 2, 3 diagonals. And for a triple crochet, you wrap the yarn 4 times before you enter the hook, and you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 diagonals. So there is a way to recognize stitches from the side. And I just find this a very nice, clear, concise side view, because stitches all look the same from the top. They all look like that V loop from the top. So you really can't recognize it unless you're looking at it from the side. Okay. The second one I've got is, and this happens to be a project that's working the round. There's 2 parts to a crochet stitch. You have the post, which is the body of the stitch, and it could be the single, the half double, any of those. This happens to be I'm looking here, a double, because it's got 1 diagonal crossing and it's got more stitch. I know it's not a half double because there wouldn't be more stitch underneath that. So you've got that's called the post of the stitch. And then at the very top, the V's that look across the top are the loops. Okay. So when you're working in the round, the post, the loop that is connected to the post. So this is the post for this stitch. The loop is always going to be slightly to the right. This is the loop that connects with this stitch. That's a whole stitch right there, the post and the loop is always a little bit to the right. Now, that only works if you are working in the round because you're staying on the right side the whole time. If you are working back and forth, slide over here. If you are working back and forth, and I've got some double crochets here, I'm going to chain 2 and turn. So the loop that is associated with this post right here, this is the loop. But when I go back to work the other side, it is now no longer to the right, it is to the left. So you do need to, you don't always need to know, and your pattern may not always tell you if it might be a reversible stitch, but knowing where you are in your pattern is important if they want you to go into the correct loop. So now the loop that's associated with this post is to the left because I'm on the back side of this work. So I often will mark, a right side or a wrong side. I almost always mark the right side because that's just easier for me to remember. So I'll just hang a stitch marker, especially if I'm going to be putting it down a lot. I'll just hang it just on a stitch. So I know if I can see the stitch marker, that is the right side of the work. And I know that my loops are connected to my post to the right. If I can't see my stitch marker, I'm ready to work this row, I know the opposite is true. So just knowing where you are and what side you're working, even if it's just a baby blanket or something, if you've got some pattern change, knowing that is important. For the most part, crochet can look mostly reversible, but there are subtle differences, and this is one of them, okay? So recognizing your stitches in the round is one thing. Recognizing your stitches, this is one of the biggest thing new crocheters, and I would even say experienced crocheters. This is something I still sometimes if it's a more complicated pattern, if it's not something I've done before, I will still do this if I'm working back and forth. If I finished a row, knowing where my row ends. That and what stitch I should go into last. So I just did double crochets here. So I'm going to chain 2. I'm going to turn my work. I'm going to yarn over. I'm going to go into the first stitch here, and your pattern will tell you what to do. I'm going to make my first double crochet, and now I'm going to stop. So now I've made my first double crochet. Here's the post of it. And because I'm making it, this is the front of this stitch, if that makes sense. So this is the back of this stitch down here. This is the front. So the loop is going to be to the right if I'm looking at the front of the stitch. I put a stitch marker in the top loop of the very first stitch I made in the row. That way, and I just hang it on the actual loop. After I work the rest of this row and I come back, I know where I won't be confused by my chains and the top of the stitch. I'll know where to end my row, and then you don't get sides that go wonky. So I'm gonna work across here, double crochet. So if my stitches were changing, that's generally now when I do that, I can recognize my stitches now, but early on, everything I did went wonky until I started putting those stitch markers. So for new crocheters, I recommend getting 3 stitch markers. One to mark your where you started, front and back, to hang on the front, and one to mark the first stitch of each row until you are confident that you can recognize the stitches and where they end. So here I've got one more to do. But when I was making that row, I could have marked it then. No, actually I have 2 more to do because my chain 2 counts in this particular pattern. Oops, sorry about that. So now I've worked across. Let me zoom out just. I'm going to chain 2, turn, make my first stitch. And anytime I take my hook out, I just pull a big loop, and then I'm less likely to lose the stitch. I'm going to put a stitch marker through the loop that's attached to my first stitch. So now I have a stitch marker on each side, and I can work across this row, and I know that my last stitch is going to go right here where I put that first stitch marker, and I don't have to think about it, and that will keep my sides straight all the way through the project. So there might be increases, but at least you know, so you may not have straight sides, but at least you know you're going and you're going to keep your stitch count correct. And then every once in a while, you know, count your stitches. I find the easiest way to count stitches is to count the loops across the top, is to count the V's. And since I've marked it, I know this is the first one. I'm not inadvertently counting a chain, which if I had chained a little loose, it might look like the top of a stitch, but since I've marked it, I'm sure. And then I can count the V-shaped loops across the top of the posts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I have one more here, 8. I think that's a little bit easier than trying to count this way. And that's just the easiest trick for me to do. Does anybody have any questions about recognizing stitches? Feel free to jump in with questions anytime. I feel like the stitch markers are a game changer. Those can really save, even when you're working in the round, putting a stitch marker on your very first stitch, so that, especially if they are single crochets and the stitches aren't very tall,
Pam.
Yeah,
So because you're doing a double crochet, that's the reason when you do the chain 2 turn.
yeah.
Is it because your pattern told you to do that, or is that just something that is like a basic?
That's a basic. For generally the number of chains corresponds with the height of the stitch. So and it has to do with how many yarn overs you're doing during the stitch. So
And then
if
you
I was
count it
doing,
as a stitch
right.
then too.
So if I was doing a single crochet or half double crochet, I would just have to chain 1 because it's only 1 stitch high. And I just need that 1 stitch to be like the bend so I can go up the side.
Yes.
A double crochet, you yarn over twice during the stitch. So you do 2 chains, a triple, 3.
Yes.
Because it's taller, and that's where this gets helpful too. And that actually I could put underneath here how many chains I would put. So you would just need 1 chain for these 2 chains, 3 chains, 4 chains, and 5 chains.
Yeah.
Because each stitch is a little bit higher. So at the end of the row, you need to make sure you're giving yourself another height, or your sides will do this if you don't give yourself enough height.
Yep.
So you might have the same number of stitches across, but if you didn't chain up enough height, your stitches, your sides will start to bend in, and then you get the wavy in and out. Yeah,
that's flat. Okay, so if you're doing it in the round, you do the same thing, and then you would count it as a stitch.
Correct. And generally, your pattern will tell you at the beginning. Look for your pattern notes.
Okay.
Most patterns will tell you, and it's usually written somewhere in the notes, and I think we talked about this in chart reading. It will tell you if your first chain or your beginning chain, if it's in the round, counts as a double crochet or not.
Okay.
And usually how they have you joining it, slip stitching and joining it together, tells you. So either they're going to have you bridge across, or they're going to have you join in the top of the 2 chains that I made in this one for double crochet.
Okay.
But again, if I was doing this in the round, I would mark this. Here's where I started my round with 2 chains. Here's my first post. And here's the loop because it's to the right.
Yes.
I would mark that, so I would know that's the top of the first stitch I made. So as I came around, if my tension isn't quite even, I could just keep going, and you would end up with a spiral, which some patterns, that's what you want to do. But if you are finishing a round, you need to be able to bring it together, and knowing where you started can be very helpful.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
You got it. Okay. So I'm going to come back to the working in around in just a few minutes. I'm going to talk about foundation stitches. So in Donna's pattern, her pattern has her starting the collar of her shirt, and it says FSC, which stands for Foundation Single Crochet. And what that is, it is making the chain row and the first row of single crochet all at the same time. You can also do it with, it doesn't have to be a single crochet. You can have a foundation half double crochet. You can have a foundation double crochet. That part doesn't matter. It's just making the chain and the first row at the same time. Some people hate making the chain and do this instead. They find working into the chain really uncomfortable, really hate doing that. So here's what you can do. So you start with a slip knot. I'm going to show you the foundation single crochet. Okay. Start with a slip knot, and I'm going to chain 2. You need 2 stitches to start with, and what this will end up being is part of the side of the stitch. Okay. Now I'm going to go into the second. Let me tilt my camera just a little. I'm going to go into the second stitch away from the hook. I'm going to yarn over and I'm going to pull up a loop. Now I have 2 loops on my hook. Okay, I'm ready to start. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make the chain part of the stitch. So I yarn over and I pull through 1 loop. Right here, I'm going to zoom in just a little. I've just made the chain part of the stitch. Now I'm going to make a single crochet on top of it. So yarn over, pull through both loops. So from the side, and then you can tighten this up a little. I made a chain and a single on top of it. I'm going to repeat. So now instead of going 2 chains away from the hook, I'm going to go into that under both loops of the chain that I made, the first chain that I made here. I'm going to go under. I'm just going to loosen it up a little. Both loops. Yarn over and pull up a loop. Oh, tilting my hands the right way here. Make the chain, make the single. Go under the previous chain, make the chain, make the single. Go under the previous chain, make the chain first, make the single on top of it.
See, that's what I should have done because it would have made, because I think this twisted when I just did the chain and then went back all the way around with single crochets in it.
Yeah, you
And
got a twist in it.
Yeah, I think, and because it's right there in the front of the neckline where I joined,
Yeah,
I had to turn the stitch a little bit and it's really, I'm not real happy with it.
how far away are you from it?
I'm all the way around to the 7th and 8th row.
So
right?
I think we can go back and do across the front, like a little row of single crochets at
You
the
mean
end.
at the end to come back?
Yes,
Okay.
we can do that
Because
to,
it's got like a little dip and it kind of wants to twist.
we can make it look prettier.
That'll be okay, because I know that's right in the front.
Right. So what you end up with is the row of chains with the singles on top of it. Now the only difference I will say, and I've got this one here. I'm going to zoom out. Here are 15 that I did as a foundation single crochet. Now, now you don't have to go into a chain stitch, which is, if you're working really small like you are, could be very helpful. If you are making a blanket and you're not sure how big you want it to be, it can be really hard to tell how long something is just by the chains. But by having, now I could make this longer, because once you've committed to your chains and then you go back to work across them, you can't extend it at all. So here, if I was judging, I'm like, oh yeah, or if I'm making a dishcloth, that's not quite long enough. I could continue to make the foundation stitches and add on to this without having to start all the way over again. Now, what you do have, so that's 15 stitches done in foundation single crochet. Here are 15 stitches done, and it twists a little, with a chain and then the single crochet in top of the chain. My tension's very different. Yeah. So now that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you do need to know. I do find that this is much stretchier though than the chain. I think the chain is keeps it from being terribly stretchy.
Yeah.
This one I could very easily stretch. So if you were doing it around the collar of your neck, I think you would, even though it looks shorter, it has a lot of give to it.
Yeah.
Where this one doesn't have
sense.
It doesn't have quite as much give to it.
Yeah.
So you can do that. It doesn't have to be just the single crochet. You can do it with, I don't remember what needle I was using. You can do it with, So just recognizing that your tension is going to be different, but that this one is stretchy is really what I wanted you to show you.
Yeah.
This is much more rigid, doing the chain and then the single into it. Okay. And you'll notice it doesn't twist.
Yes, I did notice.
So,
I laid flat.
Right. So you can do this with any of your stitches. So to do a double crochet, you start with a yarn over, go into the chain from the stitch that you've just made, pull through. Now you always make the chain first. So make the chain and then make your double like you normally would. Pull through 2, pull through 2. So now I have a double on top of a chain. So you can do it with any stitch, just remembering that you have to make the chain part of it first, and then, so I have to stop and think, because if you don't do your yarn over first, or if you just forget to make the chain, your stitch won't be even across. So you do have to remember to make the chain part first, and then make your double on top of it.
Wow. I do like that so much better.
Yeah, after you and I had talked, I'm like, I'm going to look for a better way to do this. And so that might be very helpful for you. So, you could rip it all out again if you want to, but next time.
Next time, yes.
Yeah.
For sure.
You might like that.
Yeah,
and then,
but if I can go back and just do a little single crochet.
I think we can do that. And, we can do it on a slightly smaller hook, so it's nice and tidy and neat. And I'll help you do that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So those are foundation stitches. So even if your pattern doesn't call for foundation stitches, you can certainly do them. And many people just do, it's just how they like to do them, because they don't like work, especially if it's like chain 200 or something,
Right.
And if you've got to join it in the round. So, or just working a blanket, if you're just deciding how big you want to make it,
right,
you can do that. Okay.
Right.
So those are foundation stitches. All right. Now I'm going to show you, let me pull that out.
It would have been nice if the designer would have done that in her tutorial.
Yes.
No?
Yes. And not many designers tell you to do that. I think it's just become a matter of preference for some people.
Yeah.
On what they prefer to do.
Right. Well, and it's true with knitting across two different,
Exactly.
techniques that you can do, that just because the designer didn't tell you to do that, slip that first stitch in the row,
Right.
that you can do it. And it's,
right.
Just learning the terminology with the crochet.
Right. So if you're doing something in a round, most patterns will have you chain a certain number of stitches. Here I've chained 4 stitches. And then you go back to the stitches furthest away from the hook and you make a slip stitch. So you pull it through and pull it through to create a ring. And then you make your stitches into the ring. So I was making double crochets into the ring. I would then chain 2 and go into the ring to make my double. Into the ring. So I'm going over those original chain 4 stitches. Those are my ring. And you can work all the way around, however many your pattern calls for. And depending on how many you're putting into the ring, the pattern generally will, I would say 3 or 4 stitches is common for a ring, unless you're putting a lot of stitches in to start. They may have you chain 5 or chain 6. It also depends on the weight of your yarn. But what you're left with is a hole in your ring, which could be a design element, which is fine. But it's hard. You can't tighten it. You can sew across it. If you're putting a lot of stitches, it will close up, but you are going to be left with a hole. So instead of doing that, let me just cut that off. There's something called magic ring. There are a lot of videos out there about how to do this. I have found this is the one that made the most sense for me. And actually the crochet site that I'm recommending shows it a completely different way, which is how it works for her. I think I've seen 5 or 6 ways to make the magic ring. This is what made the most sense to me. So that's what I'm going to share with you. Okay. So I take 3 fingers. Okay. So I take my 3 fingers. I take my yarn. I leave, well, like maybe just a regular amount of tail, 4 inches or so. Okay. I'm going to wrap it around my 3 fingers. And then in the back, I'm going to crisscross it like this. But I'm going to make it parallel on the front. So I've got 2 parallel lines. It crisscrosses in the underneath my fingers, okay? I'm going to hold that crisscross with my thumb, okay? I'm going to work on the top of my hand to make my magic ring. To make the magic ring, I go underneath the first loop and I hook the yarn. I come back over that first loop and I hook the same yarn again and pull it through. And when I slide it off my fingers, I've got a slip knot on my hook. I've got a loop and my tail is winding through. Don't unwind the tail. You want it to be that way, okay? You also don't need to tighten it up. Just let it hang just like this. And you are gonna work across where these 2 pieces, the tail and the loop are overlapping. That's where you're gonna work across. So I'm gonna do double crochet again, chain 2. And I'm going to do 6 double crochets into the ring. So what I'm just going over those 2 pieces of yarn. It's a little fiddly, like any beginning cast on or chain. There's 2. I'm going to do 5 because I'm going to count my chain 2 as a double crochet. So I've done 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's my double. And 1 more. Okay. So now, let me pull my loop so I don't lose it. I'm going to take my tail, I'm going to hold on to my stitches, and I'm going to pull it. No hole.
Wow.
Yes, it's the best. And you don't have to do it till the end. So you can do all, you could do it, a couple, you get your next row done. So if my pattern was having me slip stitch in the top of my chain 2 that I started with, which is a pretty typical, here's my chain 1, here's my chain 2. So I'm going to slip stitch in there to join. So now I've got no hole.
Beautiful.
So like I said, there are lots of ways to do it, but that's my favorite. It just made the most sense to me. The principles are always the same, but how you wrap it around a finger or a hand can be different. I found that the least amount of fiddly to do it, to wrap it around your hand that way. So I highly recommend the magic ring. So anytime a pattern tells you to start with like a chain 4 and make a ring, you can substitute this. There's no reason why you can't. I've never come across a pattern where it's an issue, unless you need to have a hole. If it's, you're threading something through it or something like that. But even doing that, you don't have to pull the hole completely tight. You can leave it as loose as you want. Just work across it. This again. Mhm. Okay, so now you see why you don't want to unwind that. I can pull it. So I could still leave a hole if I wanted to, or I could pull it nice and taut. If I can also loosen it back up a little when I'm ready to join. So that's the magic ring, which I love. I haven't chained to start anything in a really long time. Once I learned that, that was a game changer. Yeah. All right, let me cut that off. Okay. So now I'm going to show you how to do, which I like, it's called an invisible join. This is when you are, either you're completely done with whatever you're doing in the round, or you are finishing a round and then they want you to start the next round in a completely different place with a different color. You want to make sure you're not just going to be chaining two and working up. This is completely finishing this round, not to be worked into the same stitch again. Sometimes a pattern will have you, for different kinds of granny squares, may have you, finish a round and then, count over 2 double crochets and start the next round here if it's going to have, for whatever reason, for whatever design element. But to finish the round with an invisible join, put it back on my hook so you can see. Now we finished. I practiced on this one, so let me take it out real quick. Okay. All right, so this one was doing double crochets all the way around. I did 2 double crochets in each of the double crochets below. So I'm going to finish. Here was my chain 2 that acted as 1. So I need to make 1 more double crochet so I have even pairs. So I'm going to go in here, make my double. Okay, and let's just assume I am done at this point. All right, so I'm going to leave a long tail, maybe 8 inches or so, cut it, and then pull the end through. Don't pull it tight, just pull it through so that that loop is secured and caught on the end. Use a darning needle. And I generally have to look this up, so we're going to hope I remember. Okay, so I want to join this in the, I could have just done a slip stitch into the second chain and pulled it through, but it will leave a little bit of a gap. It'll and a little bit of a divot in it. This is what prevents getting a divot. So I'm going to go from back to front. I'm going to go underneath the loop that I'm joining to, which happens to be the top of my chain 2. And I'm going to pull it through. And I want to I'm going to pull it so that it pulls that stitch over without pulling it overly tight because I want it to look nice and even around. Okay. And then I'm going to go, instead of going underneath these top 2 loops, I'm going to turn it just a little and I'm going to go underneath the back loop. So I'm going to go kind of into the center of the loop here. And I'm going to go underneath the third loop of a stitch. Let me pull that out again so I can show you. Every crochet stitch every loop really has 3 parts. It's got the two that you see on the top, the two loops, and there's always the third loop right underneath it, okay? We're gonna go in between there. So let me do this again. All right, so I'll go from the back to the front, underneath the top two loops. Pull to bring that stitch over, not too tight. Then I'm gonna go into the center here. I'm gonna go underneath the back loop and the third loop. And you'll see as you pull that through, I've created another loop. Looking from the top, you cannot tell where I've joined it. It doesn't leave that little divot. So unless you were looking to see where the yarn was coming, it just looks like the regular loop. So what I've done is created a loop I've created an extra stitch, which is why you need to make sure this is the end. It would throw your stitch count off otherwise. Sometimes a pattern will have you do an invisible join and they account for the stitch count. But if this is the end of whatever you're doing in the round, you can finish this way because then your stitch count doesn't matter, okay? And then I'm going to move into the next thing that I was going to show you is securing your ends or weaving away your ends. So I want to keep that tension fairly even. So everybody's got their own way they like to weave away ends in knitting. In crochet, you have a little, I always do it on the reverse side if there is a reverse side. And I'll weave away my magic ring here in a minute. I want to keep the tension on that loop even. And because crochet stitches are a little bulkier, I think it's easier to hide the stitches. I like to go underneath either 4 or 5 loops. Pull my end through. That's my end, there it goes. And then I'm going to come up, go a different direction, and go underneath 4 or 5 loops. And I think it's much easier to hide ends in crochet because those stitches have so much bulk. Yep, I got my magic loop, my magic ring end caught in there. Let me get it out. There we go. So you can go up and down through the posts, as long as you don't pull it to the other side and you just go underneath one side of the post, but always go in one direction, reverse the direction, another direction, and I do it at least 3 times. And I might split the yarn as well to finish off. Trim it and let it pop back in. If you are not opposed to knotting, I think it's easier. You can put a little knot in crochet. I think it very rarely ever shows up. So I could have kind of knotted this a little bit, pulled it tight just on the stitch, and then trimmed it. But from the front, you can't see it at all. So I started this one in a magic ring. So I can still tighten it up so that I don't have a hole. And for the magic ring, to secure that end, what you do is you're going to continue to go in the direction that your yarn is coming out of. So if you're right-handed, you're going to continue to move in a clockwise direction, and I'm going to go under all of those stitches that went into the ring. One time. This is why you want to leave yourself enough tail. I'm going to go under just one set of stitches once more, and then I'm going to reverse course. You have to do one more stitch so that it catches. If I had just turned around, it would have just pulled itself out again. And then go all the way through those one more time. Pull my end. There we go. If your yarn is very slippery, I suggest if you've got a really, I think this works very well on superwash wool. I think it works very well on acrylics. But if you have a really slippery, I want to say maybe bamboo or silk yarn, if you're doing something, test it out first, because sometimes I feel like it doesn't hold itself. So I've pulled that. It's not even pulling my knot anymore because I've given it nowhere for it to pull, and I've just secured my end. And then it's going to stay. So it's not pulling loose at all. Nice and tight. If you're working back and forth and you need to secure your yarn, same thing. I go in and out of the, I'm going to take this bit out. I'm going to trim this so it's not quite so long. Again, you just want to go in reverse directions and do it at least 3 times. And then I feel like it's secure. I will often go through my loop so that even if and then I secure that without pulling too tight, because I want it to stay consistent. And then I just go in and out under 4 or 5 loops in one direction. It's easier if the stitch is taller because you've got more to go to. You know, if you've got a seam, same thing, like if you're knitting, you can go into a seam and do it if you've got a seam close by. But go one direction, and over, go another direction. So it really has to get pulled in several directions before it would want to come out. And I think it's just easier to do in crochet than it is in knitting. And after I go one direction, I give it a little tug to make sure I'm not pulling too much tension so it's not tightening up. And then maybe one more time here. And then I generally, at the very end, try to split the yarn, because then it really will try to, especially in a wool, it will stick to itself. I could absolutely, I'm going to show you, you can absolutely knot. I think in knitting, it's, some people never like to make a knot. I got no problem with knots if I can hide it. In crochet, you can almost always hide it. So it came out here. I'm going to go under that loop. Pull it through here to pull a knot. And I'm holding it so that it's only tightening at the knot. It's not pulling the rest of my yarn. You can't see it. You can't really feel it. I would just go like right here. So even if the end popped out, it's not going to come undone. You know, recognizing what your if it's a garment, if it's a blanket, if it's a toy, if it's something that's going to hang on the wall, I don't think you got to be that careful because it's not going to get messed around with a lot. If it's something a kid's going to drag around a bunch, you might want to put in a knot or two. just to save yourself some trouble. So I can't feel the knot. I don't see the knot. It's much easier to hide in crochet, I think. So that's how I like to weave away ends in crochet. Go underneath 4 or 5 loops on the back side or any side because you really can't see either side. Go a different direction, go a third direction. If you're really concerned, you could go 4 times, but I think 3 is good. So it's still probably maybe 2 or 3 inches of, maybe 2.5, 3 inches of yarn, which is typically what I do in knitting as well. It's just a little easier to hide. Okay, last, I'm going to show you how to join yarn. Okay, so I'm going to show you on 2 different colors. If you are, this technique works well if you are adding a second ball of yarn. This is using a magic knot. Okay. But so that you can see it, I'm going to use 2 different colors of yarn. But you would use this if you were just joining a second ball and you weren't at the end of a row or at the end of a round or whatever. You can join anytime. You can use this in knitting and crochet. So essentially what you want to do to make a magic knot is you want to take, I want to tie the green yarn to the red yarn, and I want to tie the red yarn to the green yarn. Okay, so I'm going to start with the green yarn. I'm going to just do, I'm going to tie it around, the red yarn, just with a simple half knot there. All right, so now the green yarn has been tied to the red yarn. Now I'm going to go over here, I'm going to take the red yarn and I'm going to tie it to the green yarn. So this could be your old ball and your new ball. It's just easier to see with 2 colors. So just with a simple half knot, tying the red yarn to the green yarn, okay? So green's been attached here, red's been attached here. Then I take my ends and you pull. And those 2 knots, you can see, are coming together. You can trim the ends. Now you can either leave the ends long enough to weave away or you can trim them. It totally depends on how comfortable you are. I mostly just trim them because that knot is not coming out. I'm pulling pretty hard there. So that's how you get a magic knot. So if you're doing it with 2 yarns of the same color, connecting an old ball with a new ball, you just have to keep it straight. I'm going to tie the old ball to the new ball with a half knot. Now I'm going to take the new ball, tie it to the old ball with a half knot. Pull my 2 together. So it's pulling those 2 knots against each other and they don't want to move. They've really been locked together. So you could leave longer tails and then weave them away, but it leaves I think a really great, you got to know your fabric. You got to know where you are in your pattern, if that's going to show or not. This is pretty chunky. So, you know, if it was under an arm or something, I wouldn't care. You know, to me, I know it's not going to come undone. I mean, you really gotta, if you're not sure if it's a slippery yarn, test it first and really give that a tug to make sure it's not going to come out. Often when you've got a ball of yarn and you find a knot in it, if it's this kind of knot, I tend to leave it as long as it's not going to interfere with your pattern at all. Sometimes called a tailor's knot as well. There are other kinds of joins that you can do. There's a Russian join. There's all kinds of different joins. I find this is easy and quick. You don't need any tools and you can keep going. So that's the magic knot. Now, let's see. If you were, let's find some crochet I worked on here that I didn't leave away. Now let's do this one. Just do a few stitches. So now if you are crocheting and you are changing colors, which is very common in crochet, I'm going to do, I'm going to do a foundation. Make the chain, make the stitch, go into the chain, go into the chain, make the chain, make the stitch. You can tell this has been in my house. It's covered in Herschel hair. Make the chain. Sorry, go into the chain. I should have picked chunkier yarn, it's faster. Make the chain. Make the stitch. And just do one more here. Make the chain. Make the stitch. Okay. Nope, I didn't. I made the stitch without making a chain. It was too short. Make the chain, make the stitch. Okay. Chain one and turn. I always like to chain and then turn. I find my turn is more even. Okay. And then I'm going to do single crochets across. Just do a couple rows here. And then turn. Okay. So my next row after this one is going to be red. To get my new color up without having, I could finish, start my new yarn. Let me put some off there. And I could use my new yarn to make my chain just by looping it over. It's a little fiddly, and turn. You have to adjust your tension a little and then work across. Yep, I worked with my tail. How about that? Let's try that again. Okay. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. And turn. Okay, so my next row, I'm going to go back to green. You do get a little bit of like stitches overlapping when you do it that way. I like to do it And this works no matter what stitch you're doing. My last stitch, the very last yarn over you make with your new color. So I still have to do a yarn over and pull through to finish my single crochet. I'm going to go back to the green and do the yarn over, pull it through. Now it's pulled up my new color. Chain one and turn. And you can use this to carry up your yarn as well, you know, if it's only a couple rows. But you get a very even change in color, and you don't get this little loop of your extra old color in the stitch. So doing your very last yarn over in whatever stitch you're making, I could be doing double crochets, which I'll do on this row. Makes it nice and even. And one more. So start the stitch with your old color. Do everything but the final yarn over. I have one more yarn over to finish that stitch. Yarn over with your new color and pull it through. It leaves that row completely green without adding the red or the change in it. So the red, we did it that way. It keeps it completely red, keeps it completely green. So doing your very last yarn over in your new color. This works great for in the round. If you're working in the round. And I tied that one off. Pull one of these out. If I was doing my next round in a new color, I could slip stitch to join. But my slip stitch I would do with my new color. So whatever your yarn over is, we'll pull up that new color and not interfere with the previous row. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then I can go that way from there. So now each row is its own complete color. These are very different yarns, so they're overlapping a little bit. But just remembering doing your last yarn over in your new color, no matter what stitch you're doing, it will work.
Yeah.
And leaving yourself enough tail to weave away the way we talked about.
Yeah.
You would take the new color when you weaved it in, you would go up then into
Correct.
the green color.
Right. So when you've got two ends, you know, like this, you want to weave one direction and one go the other direction. That way you don't get bulk.
Right.
And they're pulling in opposite directions. Yeah.
That works.
Yeah.
Beautifully.
So that's all I have for you guys today.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hope that was just some little tips that might make crochet a little easier, or
Yeah.
Or want to get back into it?
or maybe want to get back into it. Yeah. For me, the magic knot and the magic ring were game changers. I just liked the way it looked, especially the magic ring. I liked the way it looked so much better
Yes.
when I was making granny things. Or flowers or anything that's worked in the round that way. It's like,
Yes.
oh, that is so much better.
Yes.
I don't use the foundation stitches terribly often. I tend to do most of the crocheting I've been doing lately, I would say, is in the round. So the foundation stitch doesn't necessarily apply. But now that I found this tutorial, I found this one the best one. I would seriously consider it on my next project, because working in all those little chains can be.
a pain.
a pain for sure. So I'll put up this video, and I'll put the link to this website, which I thought was excellent. She had all kinds of about how to choose colors. Just a really nice website, and it's a really nice Facebook group too. A lot of questions get answered, and a lot of ideas to share. Really nice group. So I highly recommend them. And it's called what did I say? Crystals and Crochets. I just have it bookmarked on my page. So I'll put that up there as well. So.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for another fantastic class.